Hi there, welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Netanyahu has fired Gallant edition. And man, I'm starting to hate making these because the news from Israel just keeps getting worse. On the face of it, we're just talking about the firing of a minister, which happens all the time. Not that big a deal. But there's so much more to this. This is the opening salvo of a new stage of Netanyahu's consolidation of power and attempts to interfere with an investigation against him and to provide permanent exemption for Haredi men from um, from the draft. And it also hampers the Israeli war effort on the eve of a potential attack with Iran. So this is about as severe a move as you can imagine. There's so much to unpack about it. So let's start with talking a little bit about the person who has been fired, Yoav Gallant. Gallant is responsible to a great extent for the events of October 7th, just like everyone else in the brass of the Israeli security apparatus. There's no question about that. But unlike a lot of other people in that apparatus, Gallant has redeemed himself in so many ways. He was responsible for a lot of the planning of the Beeper operation, assassination of Nasrallah, assassination of Sinwar, the very successful military operation in Lebanon. Certainly, some of the failures in Gaza are on him as well. But also, very importantly, he stood up to Netanyahu on some very important issues on trying to pass a day after plan, which was one of his main points, on trying to make sure that Haredi men went to the army, which is something the army kept asking for because they have a shortfall of personnel. And he also stood up to Netanyahu on the judicial reform before the war. So we're talking about a man of principle who has stood up for the independence of the IDF and against the worst and most extreme decisions that Netanyahu has made. All that is a reason for there being a lot of tension between Netanyahu and Gallant throughout the war. There was recently an attempt by Gallant to mend some fences, but it was not very successful. So, because of these tensions over every single one of these issues, Netanyahu has been looking for a reason and a time to fire Gallant for quite some time, but he hasn't done it. One of the reasons he hasn't done it is because last time he did, during the judicial reform, there was a massive outcry in the Israeli public, something called the Gallant Night, Leil Gallant, where people went out into the streets to demonstrate against Netanyahu, and actually he rescinded the resignation. Another reason is because Gallant is more popular than Netanyahu in the public, and that means that there will be an outcry. And of course, Israel's in the middle of a war, and it certainly seemed, or we certainly hope, that Netanyahu also wants to win that war. So changing defense minister, especially defense minister who's had so many successes in the middle of that war, would be a bad idea. But that changed. A couple of things made this change. Both of them are political and have nothing to do with national security. Because in terms of national security, right now, with Iran on the verge of a response, national security terms, this is not a good time. Also, the operation in Lebanon is reaching culmination. Not a good time. So, why is this happening? Um, Reason number one, the crisis over the draft notices. So, just yesterday, the Defense Ministry issued 7,000 draft notices to Haredi men. And since there's no law anymore to protect them, that would mean that they had to report to the army. The government has been unable to put forth a law to regulate this issue. One of the reasons for that is because Yoav Gallant, as defense minister, has been unwilling to sign the law. And to some members of the Likud, that matters. That matters that the defense apparatus is not willing to approve it. So what the Netanyahu government has tried to do is circumvent that by ameliorating some of the worst outcomes for Haredi people of the fact that they're not protected from the exemption. So right now, there's no sanctions directly on people for avoiding the draft, but because the law that had organized the exemptions was, or not a law, but a executive measure had been annulled, they no longer received subsidies from the government. So Netanyahu wanted to pass a law guaranteeing subsidies for daycare, it's in particular, to Haredi families. That has failed as well because a lot of people in the government don't want to cooperate with any law that cements an exemption because it's very unpopular while Israeli boys are dying and the reserves are cracking under the stress of their service. So when that didn't pass, um, members of the UTJ, the United Torah Judaism, and Shas, especially led by Yitzhak Goldknopf, threatened that they would be leaving the government. They said, we're getting no benefit from being in the government. We're going to leave. Indeed, this government has been as bad for their interests as any government ever, probably the worst. They've never had their exemption expire like this under any other government. Netanyahu's really been unable to deliver for them. So they are serious about bolting the coalition. At least Netanyahu bought it. So in order to get the law to pass, Netanyahu is firing Gallant, bringing in someone who is much closer to him, Israel Katz, who some would consider a yes man of Netanyahu, who would sign an exemption, hopefully, from Netanyahu's perspective, allowing some members of the Likud to vote for the law. In addition, he's bringing Gidon Sa'ar, who had formed his own party, into the coalition now and making him foreign minister. That matters because in return for making him foreign minister, Sa'ar almost certainly agreed to vote for the exemption. So that gives him a few more fingers in favor of the deal. This makes the exemption much more likely to pass. That's one reason he did this now. The other reason is even worse. As we know, talked about this in the last video, there is a scandal regarding the theft of classified documents by the Prime Minister's office, their alteration, and their leaking illegally to foreign media outlets. That's being investigated right now by the police, the IDF, and the Shin Bet. The defense minister, former defense minister Yoav Gallant, was a big supporter of this investigation and was protecting it. Remember, the IDF and the Shin Bet are under him. Now that protection is gone. The next move is likely to be firing the chief of staff and firing the head of the Shin Bet, as well as firing the attorney general. Or at least those three moves are being considered. Those three moves would help neuter the investigation into the leaked documents. Today we found out that there's been another investigation ongoing since July. That investigation pertains to changing transcripts of secret meetings and telephone conversations that Netanyahu had. Why? And why is this a big deal? Because it appears that Netanyahu was changing these transcriptions to take the onus and blame of October 7th off himself, in preparation for the inevitability that at some point there will be a major independent investigation into the events of October 7th. So he is changing the transcripts in order to make himself look better and doubtless cast the blame on the military and the Shin Bet. By removing the heads of those organizations and the person protecting them, Yoav Gallant, that whole process will be made easier. Of course, there's also the element of distraction. The second scandal came out today. The first scandal is still rocking the country. This took both of those things out of the headlines and may well take both of those things out of the headlines for a long time to come. Now people will be talking about the draft exemption. People will be talking about firing Gallant. They won't be talking about these two investigations that make Netanyahu look like He was using the war and secret information for his own political gain. In the case of the leaked, stolen documents, at the expense of the hostages and the hostage families. Of course, another reason he did it today is because there are elections in the United States today. And the United States is completely distracted. And as we know, Yoav Gallant is very close with the Biden administration, worked very closely with them, had a good working relationship with them. In fact, Gallant was working with Lloyd Austin today on a potential reaction to an Iranian attack on Israel. The fact that he was fired in the middle of that has left the Biden administration confused, angry, but everyone's in the middle of an election now, and there's not all that much that can be done. What happens now? Well, there's already a demonstration as we're speaking, organizing in Tel Aviv. Thousands of people have showed up. I don't know if it'll be as big as the Gallant night was before the war. There's also a lot of rumblings in the IDF. The higher up you go, the louder the rumblings are. Gallant was seen by not just the IDF, but also the Shabak, the Shin Bet, and the Mossad as their protector from a prime minister who intervenes in their affairs for what they perceive as political interests. Now that's gone. Pretty soon, they fear the heads of their organizations will be removed as well and replaced by people amenable to Netanyahu. Yes, men. The vaunted independence of the IDF, of the Shin Bet, of the Mossad will be gone, at least potentially. Their investigations into Netanyahu will be dropped, or at least they will be pressured to drop them. Netanyahu will now be using the defense apparatus as his political playthings. This is a major step towards a consolidation of power that could be seen as dictatorship. There is reason to believe that some members of the security apparatus will respond to this sharply. How sharply, what measures they will take, I don't know. But the fear that all of the security apparatus in Israel will be under the thumb of Netanyahu, who is willing to use them for his political gain, is terrifying. And now there's no longer a restraint on Netanyahu's worst impulses in the war, which is the most terrifying thing in the short term. Whatever attempts there were to bring about a day after, to push for a hostage deal, to make sure to secure the relationship with the United States, all the common sense positions that Gallant took will now not be represented in the cabinet. Instead, the influence of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will be far bigger than it was before. Israel Katz is a non-entity. He doesn't have security experience, and that's why he was appointed. Gideon Saar is a man who has strong opinions, but he's been put into the foreign ministry, which doesn't run the war. He's also more hawkish than Netanyahu on many things and wouldn't be much of a balance in a counterweight. As you can tell from this video, I'm incredibly concerned about this development and we'll be following up on it. I did have three questions. All of them are kind of related to the topic here, even though that's not what I was talking about in the last video, because I was already talking about Netanyahu's scandal with the documents. So here are the questions. I was asked, does Netanyahu have immunity as PM? Can he be impeached? So there isn't a process of impeachment as such. Under certain circumstances, a minister has to resign. There is immunity for members of Knesset, including the Prime Minister, but it's not automatic. It has to be reviewed by the Attorney General and voted on by the Knesset. But that immunity is procedural. It has to do with what the members of the government do in their legislative duties. None of the stuff that Netanyahu is accused of has to do with his legislative duties. Therefore, there's no immunity there. So he doesn't have immunity, and that's one of the reasons that he's working so hard to undermine the investigation. Happy Imago asks, what would you say are the biggest criticisms of Netanyahu? He has a bad name in many circles, but how much merit is there? Is he too willing to bend to American administrations? Is he especially corrupt? Is it courting ignorant religious parties? End quote. So the biggest criticism of Netanyahu that I have and that most people have is that over the years, he has looked at his advantage as the only thing that matters. He's willing to put the interest of the state um, and mortgage them to his own political needs. And I think that in his mind, what he thinks is, I'm the only leader who can lead Israel to security and to greatness. Therefore, my survival is in the interest of the state. And therefore, there becomes a unity between him and the state that leads to him doing things like he's done today. It's not unique to Netanyahu, by the way. When leaders are in power for too long, this starts to happen. The I am the state syndrome starts to become the way that decisions are made. That's why you have to have term limits. That's why people shouldn't be in power for too long. That's why democracy depends on replacing leaders on a healthy basis. If Netanyahu had, say, had his second term from 2009 to 2013, and then went home and made money in high tech or speaking or whatever, we wouldn't be in this mess. He would be remembered as a fairly good prime minister. Even if he had gone home in 2017 after 3 terms, he would be remembered fondly. But because he's been in power for so long, he's completely corrupted himself, the country, destroyed his reputation, and the way it's looking now, possibly destroyed Israeli democracy as well. Final question. It seems Iran is going to attack Israel once again, according to their statements. What can we expect? Well, this is a tough one. They keep threatening. People say it will be after the elections. Now they're saying it might be tonight as we speak. I'm not too worried about the Iranian attack, honestly. None of the Iranian attacks have been particularly successful. They've tried all sorts of things, rockets, assassinations, terror attacks. There's been only very partial success for them. They're not that great at any of this stuff. Iran has said to the Wall Street Journal, or the Wall Street Journal has learned that they're telling Arab countries, countries in the region, that their attack will be more complex. That's another way of saying they're not going to be shooting directly from Iran, or at least that's not going to be the onus of the attack. And that makes sense because Israel took out their anti-air capabilities after the last attack. Therefore, they feel very exposed. And they know that with the elections over and with Netanyahu having now an interest to distract, he may well go for the jugular and try to bomb all of their oil refineries. He may try to attack the nuclear program. So my guess is Iran is going to try to find a way to make Israel pay in some way without getting that massive attack in in return, which they may end up regretting. I wouldn't be surprised if their attack ends up being very symbolic, because I think wants to escalate at this point for political reasons. And I think if the Iranians aren't stupid, and they're not, they know that. Okay, thank you for watching this. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media and listening to my history podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast. I'll see you here again next time something interesting happens.